So I was trying to discuss in my last video, in response to Fred, the nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality. And I thought it might be appropriate to read a chapter from Rudolf Steiner's book, Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. This is chapter 3, titled Thinking in the Service of Understanding the World. When I observe how a billiard ball, once struck, transfers its movement to another, I remain completely without influence over the course of this process. The direction of motion and the velocity of the second ball are determined by the direction and velocity of the first. As long as I remain a mere observer, I can say something about the movement of the second ball only after it has actually begun. But the situation is different when I begin to think about the content of my observation. The purpose of my thinking is to form concepts about the process I observe. I connect the concept of an elastic sphere with certain other concepts of mechanics, and take into consideration the particular circumstances prevailing in the given case. Thus, to the process that plays itself out without my participation, I seek to add a second process, which goes on in the conceptual sphere. This sphere depends on me, as is evident in my being able to content myself with observation, renouncing any search for concepts, if I have no need of them. But if this need is present, then I am satisfied only when I have brought concepts, such as sphere, elasticity, movement, impact, velocity, etc., into a certain connection with each other. To this interconnection of concepts, the observed process then stands in a particular relation. Certainly, the process that I observe completes itself independently of me. Just as certainly, however, the conceptual process cannot play itself out without my participation. Whether my activity is really an expression of my independent essence, or whether contemporary physiologists are right in saying that I cannot think as I wish, but rather have to think as the thoughts and thought connections currently in my consciousness determine, this will be the subject of later discussion. For the time being, we wish merely to establish that, with regard to the objects and processes given us without our participation, we feel compelled continually to seek concepts and conceptual connections that stand in a certain relationship to those objects and processes. For the moment, we shall leave aside the question of whether this activity is really our activity, or whether we can carry it out in accord with unalterable necessity. Certainly, it is unquestionable that it initially appears as our own. We know perfectly well that the corresponding concepts are not given without objects. That I am myself the active one may depend upon an illusion. Nevertheless, that is how immediate observation portrays the matter. Therefore, the question is, what do we gain by finding the conceptual counterpart to an event? There is a profound difference for me between the way in which the parts of an event relate to one another before and after the discovery of the corresponding concepts. Mere observation can follow the parts of a given event in succession, but their connection remains obscure until concepts are brought in to help. I see the first billiard ball move toward the second in a certain direction and with a certain velocity. I must wait to see what will happen upon impact, and, even then, I can only follow what happens with my eyes. Let us suppose that, at the moment of impact, someone conceals from me the area where the process goes on. As a mere observer, I am then without knowledge of what happens next. The situation is different if, before the process is concealed from me, I discover the concepts corresponding to the constellation of relationships. In that case, I can report what happens even if I can no longer observe it. By itself, a process or object that is merely observed suggests nothing about its connection to other processes or objects. The connection only becomes evident if observation is linked to thinking. Insofar as we are conscious of it, observation and thinking are the 2 points of departure for all human spiritual striving. The workings of both common human understanding and the most complicated scientific investigations rest on these 2 pillars of our spirit. Philosophers have proceeded from various primal oppositions, such as idea and reality, subject and object, appearance and thing in itself, I and not I, idea and will, concept and matter, force and substance, conscious and unconscious. But it can easily be shown that the contrast between observation and thinking precedes all of these as the most important antithesis for human beings. No matter what principle we wish to establish, we must either show that we have observed it somewhere, or we must express it in the form of a clear thought that anyone can rethink. When philosophers begin to speak about their first principles, they must put things in conceptual form, and therefore they must make use of thinking. Thus, indirectly, they admit that their own activity presupposes thinking. Nothing is being said yet about whether thinking or something else is the chief element of world evolution, but it is clear from the start that, without thinking, philosophers can gain no knowledge of such an element. Thinking might play a minor role in the origin of world phenomena, but in the origin of a view of those phenomena, it surely plays a major role. As for observation, we need it because of the way we are organized. Our thinking about a horse and the object horse are 2 things that arise separately for us, and the object is accessible to us only through observation. Merely staring at a horse does not enable us to produce the concept horse, and neither will mere thinking bring forth the corresponding object. Chronologically, observation even precedes thinking, for we can become aware of thinking too only through observation. At the beginning of this chapter, when we showed how thinking lights up in the face of an event and goes beyond what it finds given without its assistance, this was essentially the description of an observation. It is through observation that we first become aware of anything entering the circle of our experience. The content of sensations, perceptions, views, feelings, acts of will, dream and fantasy constructions, representations, concepts and ideas, illusions and hallucinations, the content of all of these is given to us through observation. Thinking differs essentially as an object of observation from all other things. The observation of a table or a tree occurs for me as soon as the objects enter the horizon of my experience. But I do not observe my thinking about the objects at the same time as I observe them. I observe the table, and I carry out my thinking about the table, but I do not observe that thinking in the same moment as my observation of the table. If I want to observe, along with the table, my thinking about the table, I must first take up a standpoint outside my own activity. While observation of objects and processes, and thinking about them, are both everyday situations that fill my ongoing life, the observation of thinking is a kind of exceptional state. We must take this fact properly into account if we are to determine the relationship of thinking to all other contents of observation.